I'd like to welcome you back to our study in the book of Esther. We are glad that you could join the church family in Lake Lansing Baptist Church and trust that this study has been helpful and encouraging to you. We would certainly, as we look now at chapter 6, we had started last week and we had stopped at the point in the end of chapter 10. We're going to back up to a little bit before that. If you remember, the king couldn't sleep. He was wanted to get something to deal with his insomnia. He had a reader read to him out of the government archives. Amazingly, in that set of archives, we find that the episode where Mordecai had saved the king's life was recorded. And the king, curious, said what had been done for them, and nothing had been done. So the king was determined to honor him, although this was later than it happened. And he said, "Is there someone available who's in the court that I could talk to?" And they mentioned, "Well, Haman's here." We know that Haman had hurried up, probably to be first in line, to wait to see the king. He didn't have direct, immediate access. He had to be asked, as was the custom. But he'd been counseled by advisors and his wife to don't let Mordecai upset you anymore. Go to the king, tell him about Mordecai, and we'll hang him on a gallows. And the Persian gallows was literally a pole where the dead body was then pierced on top of it. This would be 75 feet tall and clearly visible from the palace of the king. So we find that as the king says, "What do I do for someone that I want to honor?" Haman realized, the king didn't name it, and it must be me. What would I like? What would be my dream come true? And he begins to describe all of the things that he would like, from a robe and the king's horse and a crown on his head, and then one of the most noble of princes that would array this man to be honored, and then proceed in front of him around the city saying, "This is what the king does for the man that he seeks to honor." And so we find that when that is done, the king said, "Great, I like it. Go ahead and do it. Get all those things. Do it exactly as you said. I want you to honor Mordecai, the Jew that sits in the gate, and don't miss a single thing." At that point in time, Haman must have been stunned. He must have been dumbfounded, to say the least. This is not what he imagined. And of all people, the man he had come to want to be executed with the king's permission that morning before Esther's banquet, now he somehow has become known to the king. And so Haman then takes the robe and the horse, and he prepares Mordecai, and he brings him out into the city on horseback through the streets, and he proclaims loudly to those ever present, "Thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And but then we find an intriguing thing. The result for Mordecai is he is not changed. We find, in fact, when all is done, he goes back to the king's gate. Now, Mordecai must have been equally shocked. He knows what the law is. He knows what Haman has written. He knows what the king has signed. Why in the world would the king be honoring him at this point? But perhaps he may have thought that Esther had succeeded, that somehow she had worked through, that a miracle had happened, and now Haman had been defeated. What about Haman? What did he do? Well, to Haman, this is a time of great shame. He's been humiliated, and he goes to his house mourning, and he covers his head. And now the event has changed everything. We find that his wife tells him, and the friends tell him that, you know what, this is not looking good for you. If indeed Mordecai, who is of the seed of the Jews, is being honored, you will die before Mordecai. Now, please realize, Haman they say be destroyed before Mordecai. Mordecai is not out of this. It simply means that Mordecai will not die until the law goes into effect. So we find here that Haman, as he's thinking of this, sharing this, the only comfort and news he gets is all negative and discouraging. And yet, as he's there and he's mulling over what's happened, we find in verse 14, and while they were yet talking with him came the king's chamberlain. So he's not even able to prepare some kind of a counter strategy. It is time for the queen's banquet. And they came and they took him there and to the king, and then they hurried to bring Haman there to the banquet as Esther had prepared. So as we look into chapter 7, it's likely that on the way to the banquet, I imagine that the king asked, did you do to Mordecai what you had said? And I agreed. And he would say, yes, I honored your wishes. There is nothing here that would indicate the king's loss of favor toward Haman. And so consequently, there is still the law that is there. Perhaps he cannot do anything with Mordecai, but the rest of it is still in place as far as he knows. So the king and Haman came to the banquet, and now the king is there. I can imagine his curiosity has been really weighing heavy on him. In his last time at the early banquet the day before, when he made that double request, what do you want? And then he said, and what do you want? It is not a double for emphasis. He is saying to her, tell me what you want. I want you to tell me what you want. She had then persuaded him to come back for the next banquet. He's okay, we will do that. And he honors her. The meal is finished. They are now at the banquet of wine. And the king now says, what is your petition, Queen Esther? And it will be granted to you. And what is your request? It will be performed. Now, the king is giving a single request. The word petition and request go together. Esther is going to split the request. And so, as he has made that promise, we find now the queen answered. I can imagine the deep pressure that she was experiencing that has been placed upon her as she begins. How do I start this? How do I name the prime minister as the culprit? But at first she wants to know personally where she stands with the king. I don't think this is even connected with the decree that Haman has laid down. She wants to know his attitude toward her. And she said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if I please the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. Now she's had to reveal who she is. They know, or Haman would know of what's going on. I would imagine he is dumbfounded. He is wondering what in the world is happening. Now Esther is kind of at a difficult spot because she has to be careful how she words it. And she comes from a passive position. She doesn't lash out and blame the king. You signed this. You should know it. She doesn't. She said, we have been sold, I and my people. And then she uses the word to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. Those are the exact three words that Haman had used back in chapter 3, verse 13, to make sure that there was no doubt into the language of the genocide against the Jews. And then Esther seeks to reduce whatever possible tensions or even irritations might come about. But if we have been sold as bondmen and women, if we had only been sold as slaves, then I wouldn't have said anything. So she's not trying to provoke the king because, in a sense, she knows he's part of the problem. And so it is a difficult thing to be presented. She makes a statement there. Basically what she is saying is, had you sold us for slavery, at least as slaves, we would have financially benefited the kingdom. But to destroy us, to kill us all, there would be far greater loss to the kingdom than you received. And so that reveals she knows that the decision was paid for. So Haman likely now connects her words. The king does not. And he says to her, who is he and where is he that he dares presume in his heart to do so? And now Esther's plan reaches its final goal, exposure. And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And imagine carrying this out right to the last naming of the individual. Haman was stunned, to say the least. And now in his heart, he is looking, and we find that Scripture tells us that he was afraid. He was terrified, horrified that this has been exposed. Now the king is without advisors. As I mentioned before, the king turned to someone. I need some advice. The last time they met together with the first banquet, Esther had deliberately set it up in a way that there were no king's advisors there. And so when she asked for another banquet, he agreed. Now he's been placed again in a private situation without any advisors, and he's going to have to act on his own. And we find that immediately the king rises up. He steps outside of this, and it says, and in his rage he went to the palace garden. We know that as the king stood, so would Haman have stood. But Haman now has a different point. With the king's absent, his only hope is Esther. It is ironic that this whole story began with a Jew who refused to bow down before Haman. Now it's going to end with Haman bowing down and pleading with a Jew. So he's terrified in that, and he gets up and he approaches her. He is in a panic. He is violated and does violate a very crucial palace decorum. The rules were in the Persian court that any woman of the royal women could not be approached by anyone except the king and the guards, and they could not come closer than 20 to 25 feet, about 7 paces. And Haman, now in that horrified awareness, goes to the queen, and in fact he is trembling and he's shaking, and he falls down, and as he falls onto the couch that Esther was laying upon. That was how they ate their meals. And as he's falling there, he already knows the king's temperament. He knows what he's like. He knows what will likely be his fate. And yet he has done something that could not be more offensive to the king. We find then the king returned to the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the couch whereupon Esther was. And so here he is, as she's reclining there, Haman, terrified, literally, whether his knees collapsed, whether he dropped down, he drops down on the couch right next to the queen, maybe even, in a sense, touching her, as the king walks in and sees all of this. And then we find that, then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in this house? Now, just stopping at that point, there is some discussion on the word force. For example, the New International uses the word molest, that Haman was molesting sexually the queen. New American Standard, New King James, and others use what is regarded as a better translation. They use the word assault. The word literally means to tread down, to conquer, to subdue. It can, in certain circumstances, mean molest. However, she had just pled to save her people. This was a plea. This was not some sensual response by Haman. He appears to the king to perhaps, he has been informed that Haman wants to destroy the Jews. She has acknowledged she's a Jew. Is he trying to take her life? Is he assaulting her even in my palace? And as you come to the end of the chapter, realize I feel Haman was not very popular with other members of the court. I think his pride had just become to a point of he was not well liked, he was intolerable. Because one of the chamberlains, a man there named Harbona, volunteers information. Once the king has said what he says, and it went out of his mouth, they covered Haman's face, and then he volunteers this information. Behold, or take a look, there they are, and there where the banquet room is, overlooking this valley of the nobility, and there standing up high in the air is that pole, 75 feet tall. And they tell the king, behold, that gallows is 75 feet high. Haman had made that for Mordecai, who had spoken such good for the king, who had saved the king's life, and who stands even now in the gate as your assistant. And then the king said, hang him thereon. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. And as we close again, the word pacified, it's a word that speaks of the waters receding from the shore. It's the same term that was used of Vashti. And we're told that it took time for his anger to cool. But I want you to remember that though the king's anger subsided, the edict proposed by Haman and signed by the king remains in effect. Ahasuerus' actions were focused on two people. He was protecting his queen and honoring the man who had saved his life. He had not shown any greater concern for the entire race of people who are now condemned to die. We will continue with chapter 7 next week. Shall we close in prayer? Father, again, thank you for today. Use this material to remind us once again of your great power. And as we look at this whole string of amazing coincidences, we know that it's the unseen hand of God, reaching out and tracing every step. We ask your blessing and provision in Christ's name. Amen.